3, 2, 1. Good afternoon and hello. My name is Anne Linsell from Northamptonshire Healthcare, and my role today is to facilitate this virtual Wellbeing Festival live session on managing anxiety. I'm supported here today by colleagues as shown, and our presenters today are Natalie and Mustafa, who are both from the Changing Minds IAP team. This live session is part of a diverse range of events running across this week as part of our Northamptonshire Health and Care Partnership Virtual Wellbeing Festival to give us all tips and tasters to help us improve our health and wellbeing as we continue to work through this pandemic. Before I introduce this live session, I would just remind you that if you have any questions for the presenters today, please put them in the question box and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the session. You can also like questions asked by others by clicking the like button. You will find it within the questions already a link for you to provide us with your email address so that we can send you directly after the session a link to ask for your feedback. We really want and value your feedback. Our live session today will run for about 60 minutes, which does include time for questions. The session today will include a focus for us all on the challenges and ways of coping during these challenging, uncertain times. Led by colleagues Natalie and Mustafa, they will explore elements of CBT, mindfulness and scientifically evidenced techniques to help in dealing with anxiety, stress, poor sleep, constant worrying and low moods. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mustafa and Natalie.
Hi there.
There we go.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this presentation on learning how to relax and boost your well-being during COVID-19. And we're going to look at the webinar sort of format. There's a bit of a delay there. Apologies for that. I got caught off guard there. So what we're going to do today is introduce the webinar that we sort of present in Changing Minds IAP, and it's offering sort of help to manage anxiety during COVID-19. And what we did also is we sort of added some tips and techniques to help you in terms of your well-being as a healthcare worker as well, and tips to manage your stress and anxiety. So what is a webinar? They're usually 4 sessions. They're 1 hour long, and they're run by 2 facilitators, myself, Mustafa Al-Sadi, and I forgot to introduce my colleague Natalie as well, who's with us today too, and she'll chip in every once in a while, and then you'll see her in her section as well once the switch happens. So it's run by 2 facilitators. We offer a presentation of CBT, mindfulness techniques, and sort of help you in terms of coping with COVID-19. And the beauty of it is there's an anonymous question box. So it's a heckler's paradise. You know, you get messages like your face is not symmetrical and you sometimes wish you could just vanish, which I can do today. Oh, I got really easily amused by that. But yeah, I get easily amused by these things and I just wanted to really do it today. So you got that chance to see it. And accompanied by that, we get written guides. So we will send you sort of written guides and techniques sort of covered in each session. So you'd have it written and you'd be able to also see it recorded. And it's anonymous, so you don't get to see each other. No one sees you. No one hears from you. It's more of you type the questions and it's anonymous. It's accessible. You can see it live when it happens or recorded if you didn't manage to sort of attend on the time. So what we're going to cover and what we usually cover sort of in the webinars is, and it's over the 4 sessions, a toolbox of CBT. So we look at sort of the techniques and tips in terms of CBT and its cognitive behavioral therapy and how it merges with mindfulness and offers you sort of approaches that can help. So it's scientifically evidenced techniques and it's there to help with anxiety. So we look at anxiety, stress, poor sleep, health anxiety as well, low moods, problems with sleep, I mentioned it just now, and then the skill of identifying and challenging any unhelpful thoughts that your anxiety could cause. So we look at those techniques and then sort of go through them during those 4 sessions, the different strategies, and we sort of encourage people to sort of develop habits and routines, sort of give them a sense of control of what's going on. Given the whole sort of chaotic, uncertain circumstances that are happening lately, you want to sort of balance it with a bit of control and order, or perhaps a bit of chaos as well, and just dancing with it. And we give also tips and tools to sort of live with health anxiety, because it does sort of flare up in terms of the current situations, and panic attacks as well. So the webinar is informed by these two models, these two thoughts, I guess, and it's cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness. And they both sort of, in a way, merge with each other, and they both sort of support each other in the way we present things. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is cognitive behavioral therapy. And what is CBT? So CBT works on the belief that it's not the event that is causing you harm. It's your thoughts about it. It's your perception of it. It's how you react to it, how you perceive it, what sort of thoughts you associate with what happens. And CBT believes that sort of your thoughts influence your emotions, and then your sort of physical sensations and your behaviors. And then sort of that cycle there happens, and we'll give you sort of an example, I think, at one point. And then if we look at this sort of cycle and break it wherever the issue is, and sort of find ways of approaching the thoughts that we have, and make sure that they're being fair, balanced, and kind to yourself. So the common thing that we hear a lot about people sort of when they try and help each other is like, try and be happy or try and smile. It doesn't usually work. You know, telling yourself to change your mood is difficult. It's not something you can do. So what we do is we focus on the thoughts that you have, and sort of find ways of dealing with your thoughts, and find ways of sort of dealing with the emotions, and finding ways to transmute them in a different route, or finding ways to use them in a productive behavior that you find would be helpful. And it's quite a recommended sort of approach for anxiety disorders. So here's a sort of an example of textbook sort of example in terms of how CBT works. For instance, you've got a young man goes to university. He doesn't bring home in the first week. So these are the thoughts. So you've got the person, the thought, the feeling, and behavior. So the first one we're going to look at is the mom. So the mom thinks that he's probably enjoying himself. He's fitting in. Everything's fine. There's no issues. And then she feels happy and content that he is actually enjoying himself and having a fun time. And in terms of behavior, she sort of just has a positive conversation when he does actually call. And then in contrast to that, the dad thinks, hey, he's being selfish. He hasn't rung. What's going on? Is he all right? Is something going on? And sort of that leads to the feelings of being angry and upset. And then that leads to him having an argument with his son once he sort of answers the phone and sort of calls, and, you know, they have their conversation. So this is a textbook sort of explanation of how CBT can be applied. And it's a sort of a what if scenario, or a possibility scenario. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to sort of collect a sample of quotes. One of them is from a psychologist. The other three are from philosophers. Now, philosophers make great case studies, and they don't hold back. So they will say things, and they will get into taboo subjects, and they're amazing for that. So I've collected those quotes with the idea that each quote sort of presents an element of CBT. And I wanted to do it this way because it's sort of, it brings out the potential of CBT more than actually presenting it as, here are the techniques and what it could sort of appear, or this is what you should do and this is the result more of. But it's a way of life is what I'm trying to say. And that's what the first sort of quote says, that we all know individuals who can transform hopeless situations into challenges to be overcome. And it's what CBT is it's not about looking at life in the sense of having a rose-colored tinted eyeglasses. I think I messed up that phrase, but in the sense of you're not focusing only on the positive side of things, but it's more of looking at life as a painting, seeing it in all its totality and all the shades and colors. It's not just darkness, it's not just light, but it's all of these colors together forming a painting or a picture, and being able to sort of live with that and being able to sort of navigate through that. And from that sense, that's why I think it's also a way of life that we try to encourage and sort of show during the webinars as well. And the sort of second quote as well is so this quote exemplifies the point that it's about, CBT talks about what is within your control and what is without. And that's a very important distinction in the sense of you focus on the things that you can change, that you can focus on, because what's the point of worrying about something that you can't do anything about, and then that sort of disturbs your inner peace. And that causes a ripple of sort of destruction around you and negative energy and negative sort of influence around the people that you have around you. So it's, the quote beautifully says it, be confident in everything outside the will because you have no control over it. It's outside your will. and cautious in everything under the will's control. For if evil is a matter of the will, then caution is needed there, and if everything beyond the will and not in our control is immaterial to us, then those things can be approached with confidence. And that distinction is very important, because when you feel, and CBT isn't sort of, the other reason as I mentioned this quote is because CBT isn't just about thinking your way out of problems. It's not just techniques of sorting out your thoughts and there's no sort of action or behavior. It is a way of life. It is practical in the sense of what can you control? What are the things that are practical that you can do that can actually influence the environment that you're in, the things that you're dealing with. And in times like this, it's quite important to have that distinction between all the chaos around you and the bit of order that you have within you. And even in this sort of context now that I'm talking to you now, the thoughts that we have, we don't control them. I'm not generating the thoughts that I'm talking to you about. They pop up into my head and I'm picking them. Sort of like when you're having a conversation with a friend and then later on you realize you missed out on that great comeback that would have ruined their life, but you couldn't remember it at that time or it didn't pop up. But it's like having a random deck of cards in your mind and then all you can do is choose a card to think about. And the reason I'm mentioning this sort of way of looking at it is because more often than not, we blame ourselves for things that we don't have control over. And I've included this quote because I think it shows you a bit of compassion in the sense of focus on what you can control, and what you're doing is already, the amount of control we have is although little, but it's monumentous in the sense of it matters, and you deserve a lot of compassion for it. And then the third quote is, it exemplifies the idea that you have the power, the third and fourth as well, you have the power of looking at things. You have that choice to look at things in a way that takes away the sting from them. It's sort of looking at yourself as, best example I could give is like a fire. You feed it wood, you feed it plastic, you give it any material, it burns it and it grows stronger and sort of brighter. And it's the same thing in the sense of what CBT sort of accomplishes, is that it feeds you with all these techniques where you see things as challenges to be overcome, as things you can grow from, as not exactly the end or misfortunes, as the quote says, but it's a chance for you to be the sort of person that can bear it, that doesn't get crushed by the present or is fearful of the future. And this is where it merges beautifully with mindfulness in the sense of what can you focus on right now instead of worrying about the future or the past that you can't change, and then realizing the beauty that's around you. And the last quote, I had second thoughts about including, but I thought about including it because we're all dealing with currently a lot of sort of bereavement cases, whether it's personal, whether it's sort of clients or sort of staff. And I felt that it would be sort of do it a bit of justice to sort of include it and think about it in the sense of CBT does give you the idea that there is a choice in seeing things however dark they may be. And I know this is a bit of philosophy there, given that, and that's what I mentioned earlier about they don't hold back, they're able to go further. And I wanted to show the ability of CBT going quite a bit further. And in no way are the techniques going to protect you from the initial shock of something that bad happening, whether it's death or exile or being put in chains, but it's more of, there are thoughts that we have that come and get accompanied with those feelings that once something like that happens, they tend to make the experience worse. Grief is natural. Going through these difficult times is very natural, and we all go through them. The idea is that it's reducing a bit of the initial shock and the aftermath of it, in the sense of, if you were to do, and this is a horrible example, and by no way are they sort of the same, but sort of when you're like weight training or you're going for cold showers, the initial sort of shock from every cold shower you have is going to hit you no matter what you do and no matter how many times you trained. But it's the amount of time it takes you to acclimatize to it, the amount of time it takes you to sort of sit with that feeling and be okay with it, being okay with grief, being okay with what's going on. And I felt it was important to add that, given that we've all sort of going through it. And lately it's been sort of, it's taboo subjects are getting more sort of accessible because of what's going on. When back in sort of previous to this pandemic, it was more of a localized thing or some sort of a veil that these taboo things don't happen where they happen in a country or they happen to sort of certain people that do go through these experiences. But now it feels like more of a communal experience. And I felt it important to address it, to talk about it. And that's why I've included that quote. And now we're going to talk about, so what is mindfulness and how does it merge with CBT? How do they sort of work together? So mindfulness is a way of life, a way of sort of seeing things in the sense of focusing on the present moment. So what CBT does is it tries to sort of focus on, CBT in the sense of focus on the thoughts that come to our mind and sort of try and challenge them, work with them. Whereas mindfulness is more about these thoughts are happening, but I don't want to be dragged by them. I want to watch them flow by. I want to watch them sort of pass by. In a sense, it's a way of grounding you. It's a way of sort of having that sense of equanimity, that sense of not being drawn. It's a sense of being feeling that what you already have is priceless. Where you are already is a good place. It's a sacred moment. And changes are okay. Even the act of breathing, you're breathing in and you're breathing out. That's a change. The universe is change. It's what our thoughts make of it. Now, that's a quote from Marcus Aurelius. I'm not exactly sure I quoted it right, but I love my quotes. But yeah, and it's that realization of it's a give and take. There's change to it, and just being appreciative of the moment as it is. And the beauty of that is think of as well of mindfulness as this space. It increases the space between yourself and a situation, a trigger, a thought, or a physical sensation. When usually it's quite narrow. So you have a thought, you have a physical sensation, or anything happens, and then this is yourself. And this narrow space is filled with negative automatic thoughts. So the initial thought is you sort of get a cough, for instance, and then the first automatic thought you think is, oh, I've probably got COVID, or it's probably going to be something serious, or it's probably going to be something I need to get checked up, or, oh, they probably hate me, or, oh, I'm going to get fired. You know, automatic thoughts. Jump in. There's no space. There's no chance for you to just be sort of still and appreciate the moment. So what we do is we increase that with mindfulness. And by doing that, that keeps you centered, that keeps you sort of in a sense of equanimity. And then by increasing that space, you can apply all the CBT sort of thoughts that are intentional. So it's more of your thoughts happen through you by choice rather than to you by force, because of how you use mindfulness and CBT together. And what another point mentioned in the slide is that it can help you appreciate the little things that we take for granted every day, and that most of our time is it's spent on autopilot. You're thinking about something you need to do, or you're worried about something, or you're thinking about something in the past, or you're daydreaming about being the most famous person and just, I don't know, I guess sometimes vanishing away. I like that. I'm addicted to this thing. But what mindfulness does is it brings you to the moment to realize the things that you are actually grateful for. We don't take much time to be sort of grateful for the things that we already have, that are already priceless. So instead of being tortured by wanting something, by being afraid of something, and by being afraid of losing something, or of something that you can't change in the past, you're just appreciative of the moment, which is all the control you have currently. And that's all the control that you need to worry about having. And pretty much that sums up mindfulness. So here's an example of beautiful example of like mindfulness. And say you're walking your dog and you're going through the park. And usually what happens is the dog is really happy. You know, if you've ever played catch with a ball, or with a dog, not a ball, English, I speak it. You'll notice that they're quite happy. They're quite happy. I can't really express this. It's just they're very happy in the moment, and it has this calming effect on you in the sense of, hey, it's a beautiful moment right now. And it's the same when you walk them in the park. Their tails are wagging, they're really happy, and they're just enjoying the scene. Whereas this man, on the other hand, car insurance. I'm just looking at the pictures and coming up with things when I could just come up with them myself. And missing socks, I guess. And probably he's trying to compose a song, but it's not working. And mail, too much mail, and the car breaking down. Oh, I said car insurance. I can't use an example twice. But yeah, so a lot of worries there. A lot of things going on in his mind, and he can't really appreciate the moment. That is pretty much sacred, and something you can sort of cherish and have in the future to reminisce on. And it's like creating a bank of beautiful memories to sort of cherish and sort of give you that coping in times where, think of a winter night or a winter day and it's like snowing and you're snuggling up in a hot chocolate with a hot chocolate, and then, or coffee, whatever you like, and then you just remember your beautiful memories. That's not what's happening here. So what we want through mindfulness is this. It's just being able to see the moment, to cherish it, to breathe it, to live life in every breath, in every cup of tea, to see it in its totality, to see life in a grain of sand even, to be happy for the little things. And I think being in this pandemic, we've all been sort of in lockdown, and we've been sort of appreciating the little things. Myself with this magic trick, I guess, and it's just little things that make you smile, that make you sort of appreciate. And and before this whole pandemic, these things used to be so silly, but now they're just so beautiful in the sense of they matter, they make a difference to us. And it's always the little things, the little increments, the little progress, the little sort of things you cherish every day that make a big difference in our lives. And yeah, so that's my side of the slide. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to present to you Natalie. You won't be able to see me again, which is not much of a loss. I've got a face for a radio, so you'll be able to see Natalie now. And yeah, she'll present to you sort of all the different tips of sort of presenting healthcare workers sort of tips to cope with COVID-19 currently. So that's my side.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, both for that introduction and also such a good overview of the webinar that we are offering with Changing Minds IAP service at the moment, that anyone can join, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the presentation about how you can access that too. That focuses using those techniques and therapeutic approaches to really give you a toolbox of skills to help you cope with some of the stress and anxiety at the moment. As Mustafa mentioned, we're going to give you a bit of a taster from the webinar of some of the things that we might look at, and really just focusing specifically on you guys, ultimately, our health workers, our wonderful health workers who we know have been and still are working incredibly hard, as always, in extremely challenging conditions. We know that you may be feeling more stressed or anxious at the moment, and really on this slide is just a couple of the reasons perhaps why you might be feeling more stressed or anxious. So we know that you might be working extended shifts or trying to manage a heavier caseload than perhaps you normally would, whilst also trying to stay up to date with constantly changing protocols and policies at the moment. And you might have to quickly adjust really to new colleagues, guidelines, with very little time really to be able to reflect and adapt. So we know that already that's a major stress that's really understandable to have, and consequently that increasing your work schedule's intensity, as intense as it perhaps might be usually, could make it much harder for you to practice some of the self-care that perhaps you would normally use to manage that stress, and to be able to really reach out to your support network around you, which again we know lockdown and social distancing, different isolation rules too have impacted on as well. And feel free to type in as we go through some of these stresses, perhaps some of the ones that you've been really struggling with, and as we talk about some of those techniques, what you think to them as well as we go along, talking about some of the things that might help in particular. But do feel free, type in any comments or questions as we go along. Understandably as well, we know that actually the world continues to turn despite COVID. So actually some of you might be experiencing stress in your personal life as a result of COVID or not, on top of everything else that's already going on. And again, understandably, balancing childcare needs and work has been more challenging than ever for many people. You might be concerned about your health potentially, or perhaps the health risk to those around you, or just generally the health of other people that you care about very much so. And you might also be facing increasingly difficult decisions too you might be experiencing at the moment that might be more distressing than ever. So it's really easy to see why healthcare workers might be experiencing high levels of stress and anxiety at the moment, as I said, more than ever, and in particular. And thank you very much, Mr. If you don't mind moving on to the next slide for me, that'd be brilliant. But
apologies for that.
That's okay, no problem. And it's more important than ever to manage this stress as a result. You know, with so many changes occurring, it's easy to see how stress and anxiety can build up and overwhelm us. So it's ultimately the best time really to try and bring in some of that self-care and remind yourself that actually self-care isn't a luxury, it's a necessity ultimately, whether that's something that's spontaneous or planned, but making sure that we find some ways to bring in some balance into your life. And a couple of other things to bear in mind is that it's okay to not be okay at the moment. You know, it's incredibly stressful, and a lot of what many people will be experiencing right now is a normal reaction to something really abnormal happening. And anxiety and stress are natural responses, you know, to some of the exceptional challenges that we're facing at the moment. And there's nothing wrong with feeling the way that you do. And it's really important to not blame yourself at the moment. Remember, you're human, you're doing best, and you might even feel at times that perhaps you didn't feel ready for this challenge, or that you're not doing enough, that you should be better prepared. These are common sort of worries that many healthcare workers have mentioned to us that are going through their minds at the moment. But remember, nobody sat down sometime last year planning a pandemic in their diary, you know, and being able to have that time to get ourselves ready or prepared, so to speak. Remember, you're human at the end of the day, and this is a really exceptional and abnormal time that you're going through at the moment. And some stress on some level can actually be quite helpful. And similar with anxiety, really. Anxiety and stress can actually be quite protective. They can be quite motivating. They can help us problem solve. And I think there's a great quote there that illustrates that, in the sense that what man actually needs is not a tensionless state, so not to be completely free of stress and anxiety, but rather the striving and struggling for some goal worthy of him. So it's about making sure that some level of stress is a good thing, but making sure that it's manageable for you, that it's not becoming a problem and beginning to interfere with your day-to-day life. And it's also really important to remember that, as well as some level of stress or anxiety being quite helpful, it's also quite normal to experience uncomfortable emotions at times, and you might even be feeling quite angry at the moment, or maybe powerless at times, particularly maybe if you're witnessing firsthand the damage done by people not complying, you know, with certain behaviour that perhaps you feel they should be, or certain measures, or even just feeling frustrated at the situation in general. It might even impact your ability to sort of be compassionate as you normally would towards your patients. But it's important to remember that although these are really common signs of burnout and stress, you can reach out for support if those feelings become unsettling or unmanageable in any way. We've got some wonderful quotes here. You love quotes, don't you, Mustafa? I'm sure.
Oh, I do. I do want to apologize for like overloading them with quotes, and I do want to apologize that I forgot to ask you like questions during doing my slides, because the plan was to ask you about what you thought about things and sort of have a conversational thing, but I got obviously nervous because you lovely people had made me nervous. And I forgot, and I went into like the whole sort of my shenanigans and like the topics that I talk about. So yeah, so I've included these quotes as well. The first one is, begin the morning by saying to thyself that I shall meet with a busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful. And what I wanted to show is that, and they're all philosophers, obviously. Oh, except for the last one counts. Is that it's sort of a preemptive CBT, or preemptive therapy, in the sense of preparing for what may be negative. They used to always practice negative visualization back then, and it's possible to sort of prepare yourself for these things where you wake up in the morning and you say, okay, I'm going to deal with people who are not going to be grateful, they're not going to be great, they're not going to be nice, but that's a part of life, that's part of the painting of life. That's the first one. And the second one is, no one can injure you. No one can say anything to you. Nothing. If someone calls you a certain thing or describes you a certain way, they can't fix it on you. It's not true. It's not. It's think of a flower. You can crush it, but the fragrance stays there. You can throw things on it, but it's not a part of the flower itself. So in a way, no one can ascribe that to you. No one can define you other than the definition that you define it to yourself. So in that sense, and another beautiful quote that I remember is that a grape tree offers grapes. It doesn't need, it doesn't get affected by, insults, or it doesn't get affected by your compliments. You are caring, giving people. That's your nature, and there's no one that can take that away from you, or no one can change that from you. And Natalie, feel free to join in or share what you think, and what do you think about that?
Okay, so I think a lot of what some of these quotes have in common with the current climate and everything that's happening is that a lot of them are about focusing on what you can control rather than what you can't. And I think that's more relevant than ever, really. In particular, I love this quote in particular: you have power over your mind, not outside events, and realize this and you'll find strength. And it's ultimately very true. Very true that, it's very important for us to focus on what we can control, let go of what we can't. And that's a huge part of what we look at in the webinar, and what the approaches that we use are all about, really, in terms of CBT and mindfulness. Brilliant.
And in terms of sort of the last quote as well, is that I've included the last quote because it digs into sort of the gratitude side of things. He mentioned sort of wanting to live deep and suck out the marrow of life, in the sense of it's the little things that we don't pay attention to. So Henry David Thoreau is known for sort of being this person that sort of tried to be, lived in his own sort of cabin away from society and sort of loved the little tiny things of nature. And it's these little details that we're missing because of life before the pandemic, but currently, being in lockdown and stuck in our gardens and sort of experiencing the little things and seeing that there is a universe inside you in terms of all the synapses, the neurons, and all of that's going on inside you, and little microorganisms in your garden, little sort of beautiful things we never notice, even the trees dancing in the wind currently, although my fence may be broken now. We'll see. But yeah, that's basically the quote that I wanted to talk about. And what do you think about that, Natalie?
Thank you, Mr. I think that's really helpful and very interesting. And I think, all of these quotes are really relevant to what a lot of people are experiencing right now. And we've got a few more tips to go through just over on the next slide, where we start thinking about actually some different ways of managing some of these stresses that a lot of you will be experiencing at the moment. As we mentioned, it's understandable that you might be experiencing some of these stresses, but it'd be really helpful to really give you a couple of tips that you can take away today to put into practice, some nice simple ones, as well as, like I say, if it is something you would be interested in, would really recommend considering a Changing Minds IAP service COVID webinar at the moment if you think that actually you're really struggling, you need that extra support. So some of those tips include eating well and looking after your body. And it's important to remember that actually your body is your vessel. Okay, fuel it. It grounds you, and it actually influences your mental health perhaps more than you would think, in terms of making sure that you don't skip your breaks, making sure that you're eating regularly. Both undereating and overeating can affect your mood and your mental state, and it's very, very important to make sure that you find some time to rest. And I know that can sound quite a basic thing, but so often we don't give ourselves permission to do that, and so often perhaps we need that little refreshing reminder to get back to basics and actually make sure that those are in place to keep ourselves well. We also need to be careful and think about some unhelpful coping strategies really that are really common for us to slip into, and I think a lot of us can relate to this over lockdown in particular. Some people have noticed perhaps they might be drinking a little bit more, smoking a bit more, again eating perhaps has changed too, and your sleep. So we know that all of these things can have a negative impact on our mental health, and even though they're often a way of coping, and it's really understandable, particularly if you're feeling very stressed or anxious, people tend to turn to these things as a way of giving themselves some short-term relief. The problem is ultimately that relief is short-term, and that longer term actually we can make matters worse, and we can end up feeling more drained and less refreshed and more stressed as a result of it. So it's really important to just keep a check on some of those things that are really easy for us to let go. Okay, it's also important to think about healthy boundaries, really. I know you're all caring, okay? I know it's the nature of what you do and the very essence probably of who you are as people, but it's really important to make sure that we avoid the temptation to overwork. Remember, this is a situation that isn't sort of changing overnight, well, in incremental stages perhaps, but actually this is a long-term situation that we're all going through. It's important to try and pace yourself, make sure that you've got that balance in your week, and try and prevent that excessive stress, fatigue and sudden exhaustion that comes often from just working on adrenaline for long periods of time. We know that suddenly it can just hit us and we feel incredibly burnt out. And it's not important to remember that not to blame yourself, it's not your fault, but it's really important to make sure that you do get that balance in your week. And of course you can always speak to your team, line manager, colleagues, get some support if you feel you need some help coping in a healthy way. And of course we're here to help too, as well as the other resources within the trust that are being fantastically demonstrated all across this week. We also want to remember to stay connected and access support, and that's more important than ever at the moment, particularly as many of you will have been isolating, social distancing. We've probably been cut off from loved ones and our support network a little bit more than we usually would be it's really important to try and make sure you use the supports that are available to you. Still try to reach out to those loved ones and friends for support. Colleagues even can be a really unique source of support, really, to understand what you're going through at the moment. Some of the stresses unique to you and your own experience. And again, using some of the resources from Changing Minds or across the trust that are available, that are covered in this wonderful week. We also want to think about your values. So thinking about actually what's important to you, and actually thinking about your values. And what I mean by that is really about what's meaningful to you in your life, and kind of reminding you of actually what's important to you day to day that you want to focus on. So it's a little bit different to a goal. It's more like a direction that we want to head in with our lives. So it could be that perhaps you have a passion that you're particularly interested in. It could be the kind of family member that you want to be, or friend or colleague, or your work could be particularly important to you. But just reminding yourself of actually what your values are as a person, and making sure that once you've identified those values, that you can see how your daily actions match them. Often if we feel that we're not living life in line with what's important to us, it does become very stressful, and actually we kind of lose that motivation. So thinking about our values can be particularly helpful. And it's also important now more than ever, really, but always really in the line of work that many of you will be involved in, is to watch out for signs of trauma. So what I mean by that is that sometimes when we experience or witness traumatic events, it's common for many people to have some reaction to them. And actually there's lots of really normal reactions that some people will experience. There's actually a session later on in the week by a fantastic psychologist from our service, Dr. Sarah Clare, who's going to be looking at recognising this in yourself. I'd really recommend, if you can attend it, do, and recognising it in colleagues around you as well, and how to offer support. The important thing to bear in mind is that you have been through, if you have been through anything traumatic, which I'm sure many people have experienced, and you feel that you are experiencing symptoms in relation to that, so feeling on edge, for instance, feeling much more anxious or low as a result of that, if that doesn't subside, it's really important that you reach out for some of that help. Okay, and something else to think about is actually making time for relaxation too. And this is again something that seems quite basic often, and a lot of the time it gets overlooked because of that. You know, we lose the importance of making time to balance out our week, and actually making sure we've got a good balance of activities that are relaxing, as well as the ones that perhaps can be quite challenging for us. Often we focus on what we have to do, the necessary ones, the ones that actually tend to drain us, and we lose the activities, first of all, that actually rejuvenate us and make us feel good. And relaxation could be looking at breathing techniques, meditation, any activities that you find calming, exercise, for instance, or perhaps something relaxing like knitting. It doesn't have to be, you know, always sitting down doing a breathing exercise as such, but it can be a really helpful thing to think about in all of its breadth and glory, really, all the different types of relaxation that you could be making time for, and thinking about when as well to put that into your week. And remembering that actually, again, self-care is essential. You know, it's not a luxury. It is really important that you make this time to keep yourself well, and ultimately that helps you look after others. It's like thinking about when you're on an aeroplane, when you're asked to put your own oxygen mask on before you help others. It's the same thing. Ultimately, it's looking after yourself so you can help others better and stop yourself from burning out and feeling stressed and anxious, and being able to manage that. So one relaxation strategy that we thought we'd give you today to have a little go at and take away, so you've got a technique in the bag, is diaphragmatic breathing. So we're just going to take a minute or two to have a little practice of that. If you want to, feel free to join in. If you don't, then that's fine also. And similarly, if you have any breathing difficulties or any concerns, it's fine to skip it if you feel it's not for you. Okay, but to begin with, just get yourself in a comfortable position. Okay, and I want you to just place a hand on your chest to begin with, and another hand on your belly. Okay, and just notice what that feels like to begin with, and whether you notice your hands moving. Now, a lot of people might notice the hand on their chest moving. That often indicates that we're breathing quite shallowly. And again, it's not something that is necessarily a conscious choice. It can be quite automatic. And actually this can be a huge part. When we're feeling stressed or anxious, our breathing tends to be more shallow. So what we can do as a way of relaxing our bodies and reversing that process of anxiety and stress, then we can actually use diaphragmatic breathing, which is a fancy way of using our full diaphragm and our lung capacity to breathe a little bit deeper. Okay, we can use that to actually reverse that feeling of anxiety in our bodies and calm us down. Okay, so I want you to just, like I said, get into a comfortable position and just take a moment to just breathe in slowly through your nose so that your stomach moves out against your hand. And the hand on your chest should stay quite still. So just practicing that for the time being. Breathing in through your nose and letting your stomach push out against your hand. And it can be helpful to almost imagine that you might have a balloon in your tummy. And every time that you breathe in, the balloon inflates. And each time you breathe out, it deflates. And just noticing those sensations as the balloon inflates and deflates. Your stomach rising with the in-breath and falling with the out-breath. Just take a minute, settle into a comfortable breathing pattern. It shouldn't feel uncomfortable. It's fine to just relax if you feel you need a moment. And it's also something that often people feel should come naturally, some relaxation, but it takes time to practice. Okay, and when you're ready, just again, bring yourself back to the presentation. And again, feel free to type in how you found that. It's something that you normally have to do for a few minutes to really notice difference. And often the more you practice it, the more effective it is. And it can be helpful to bring it into place at times when you're not feeling anxious to begin with. So get yourself confident with the skill. And it's something that we cover a lot in the COVID webinar. So every session in the COVID webinar that we run, we actually practice at least one relaxation technique or a meditation. So if that's something you think might be helpful, again, the webinar could be really helpful for you. And we've got some feedback on the screen from some people who've been to the webinar before. So we've actually run it twice now, and we have the third round coming up tomorrow night. If you are interested, again, we'll talk about how you can get online shortly. But thinking about some of that feedback, some of the most common things that people mentioned after they'd joined the webinars, that they found it really relaxing. It was easy to follow. They found it supportive and caring, and they found it really worked for them, because a lot of the strategies that we use are scientifically evidence-based. So they have been proven to work in many, many cases. A lot of people found it uplifting and useful, actually, that they'd missed the sessions. And one of my favourite quotes that one person mentioned is that they felt that it had shown them something they'd lost sight of through this really difficult time, and that was humour. And we actually have another really wonderful quote from someone who really wanted to encourage more people to try the webinar, and were really keen to pass on their feedback to try and inspire everyone really to consider it. And if it's something that it is for you, then I think it's worth listening to this person's feedback and hearing how helpful they found it. So they said that they just wanted to say a huge thank you for putting the webinar together, and after each session they felt they were able to explain the unexplainable. I feel I've moved forward with managing my anxiety and almost feel back to my normal self. The webinar gave me some coping strategies that I'll be able to use in the future. And my husband commented that I'm completely different compared to a couple of weeks ago. I'm so grateful having attended this session and would encourage more in the future, because they really do make a huge difference to people's lives. Big thank you to the staff, and shame it's not on every week. So they were really keen that we passed on that feedback to others and to encourage other people to consider it, which I think is testament really to the fact that actually this stuff works. It can be really helpful. So as we mentioned, we promised that we would let you know how you can access it if you're interested. So again, it follows a lot of the strategies that we've discussed today and more. you know, there's so much that we've crammed into this webinar. I think that's why a lot of people have found it so helpful. And if you are interested in accessing it, they start running live tomorrow night, but if you can't make that, you can watch them recorded as well. And they're a little bit like a team session. We just use slightly different software. The best way to access them is to go to our website. The link's on the page. It's www.nhft.nhs.uk/IAPS. And if you go on to the next slide, you'll be able to see that we can scroll down, and in the blue circle, that's the button that you need to push just to register for the service. And if you write somewhere in the form that comes up, you can put down whether you want to access the service in general or if you specifically want the COVID webinar. I recommend writing in there that you're interested in the managing anxiety during COVID webinar if you'd like to join tomorrow, and it just asks for a few details just so we can make sure that we've got the best contact details for you. Okay, but ultimately that's a bit of an overview of the webinar itself and a few tips just to get you thinking about ways of managing your own well-being at the moment. And if you've enjoyed that, I really think the webinar would be great for you. Consider it, and thanks for joining us. So we'd like to open it up to see if there's any questions at the moment.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Mustafa and Natalie, excellent, very informative and lots of tips. Humour, you're right, I started to do the breathing one and started to relax and then realised I had a job to do, which was managing the question box. So the first couple of questions, someone says that they really love the dog walking image, but a question for you both is, how do I stop the negative thought cycle? And second to that would be, what is your top tip for being more mindful in the moment?
Which would you like to take, Mustafa? We'll take one each.
I'll take the challenging thoughts one because you're an expert in meditations. So what was the question again? It's sort of how to manage the negative thoughts and break the cycle, right?
Yeah, how do I stop the negative thought cycle?
So there's usually what we do in CBT is we sort of look at spotting the thoughts first. So the first thing before sort of breaking the cycle and sort of challenging the thoughts is spotting them, being able to recognize that that's a thinking trap. So we go through the thinking traps and they're different ones. So the first one is, for instance, catastrophizing. So you hear of an event and you assume that worst case scenario is going to happen. And then for each thinking trap, we have techniques to combat them. So for catastrophizing, we think, okay, is this an actual catastrophe? Would it matter in 5 years' time? How likely is it going to happen? What is the evidence to support it? Because most often those negative automatic thoughts jump in and they don't give you much time to sort of process them. It's like a machine gun that just doesn't stop, and it's just one thought after the other, and then it's the emotions that jump in with it, and it's just the snowball effect or domino effect that keeps going. So we look at the thinking traps, and if you want to sort of have a go at it early on, I'd say Google the thinking traps, have a look at them, and then sort of try noticing any thoughts that you have that might sort of fit into those. And then from there, you can sort of try and challenge each one, sort of looking at the evidence supporting it or against it, and then challenge it. And if you'd like to sort of have a more in-depth sort of view of it, join the webinar. You won't regret it. I make jokes, I try to be funny, and I fail at that, but it's funny because I fail at it.
You keep us entertained, Mustafa, don't you?
Oh, thank you. I try.
Brilliant. And I think the other question was the top tip around being more mindful.
Yeah.
That's right. Brilliant. Okay, so I think my top tip would be try and make it part of your routine. I think so often we try to bring in lots of extra different ways of being mindful or load ourselves up with these different coping strategies, which is fine, but often some of the main things that people tell us is, oh, I don't have time, you know, and often they don't always prioritize their self-care and it comes at the bottom of the list. So the best thing you can do is make it something that's going to be easy for you and that actually is going to feel like part of your daily routine and habit, whether that's making the time itself in order to actually do that, you know, putting 5 minutes aside a day for more formal meditation and mindfulness, or actually if it might be just finding time in your day already where you might be able to just practice being a little bit more mindful using your senses. So for instance, it could be when you're brushing your teeth in the morning, or perhaps washing up something that you do every day already. You know, for instance, with washing up, it might be really thinking about the temperature of the water, the bubbles, what the actual things that you're washing might feel like, what that water sounds like sloshing around, or brushing your teeth could be the taste of the toothpaste and the feel of the brush. You know, all those different senses can help you be more mindful in that moment. And it doesn't have to be, you know, a complicated practice. It can be something really simple that, again, just gives you that thinking space and that time where you can just be a little bit more in the moment. And often, as a side effect of that, we can feel more relaxed, because rather than brushing our teeth thinking about what we've got on that day or how much we've got to do, we're just thinking about what we're doing in that moment and being in the present. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you. Next question is, I would like to ask the question, if you have ADHD and find working from home causes you lots of distractions, and due to the impulsivity of the disability, how do you calm your mind enough to read CBT and change your thought processes if it feels out of your control to do so?
Would you like me to take that? Yeah, sure, that's fine. So I'll take that one. Okay. First of all, I really sympathise with you, because it is a very difficult time. You know, if we've got, like I said, this is the difficulty really with everything that's happening at the moment. We've actually got other challenges in life as well, really, that we have to deal with. And many of us are adapting in lots of different ways. And sometimes that's really hard for whatever reason. And ADHD is something that in and of itself can be difficult to manage anyway, day to day, really, and sort of experience in and of itself. So I can really understand how difficult it sounds like it's been for you, really, trying to work from home and managing those distractions. I suppose anything that can help limit the distractions is probably a good thing. If you really feel you're struggling generally with work, it might be worth having a chat with your team or your team leader potentially, and seeing if you can problem solve it specific to whatever the work is that you're doing at the time and manage that. I suppose in terms of managing the CBT side of things and really being able to sit down and take that on board, we appreciate it's not easy. I suppose one thing that, because we've had quite a few people who have had sort of other difficulties like ADHD come onto the webinar and still found it really helpful, but often they found it more helpful to watch the recordings and be able to take their time, maybe watch it in short bursts, for instance, like watching it 20 minutes at a time rather than having to sit in live for a full hour. So sometimes that could be more helpful, or maybe the actual webinar itself was more interesting, or speaking to somebody about the techniques was easier to attend to rather than sitting down and reading it. So again, it might be that actually a bit of guidance from someone else, and that's something that we offer within our service. If you are interested, if you feel actually I'm really struggling to sit down and do this on my own, then feel free to reach out for some support, and we can help with that and help adapt it in a way that makes it easier for you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Natalie. Next question for both of you, I suppose, is I live in a shared household and my housemates are not being careful or hygienic during the situation. I'm constantly anxious about this and it's not something I can control. What can I do?
Do you want to take this one, Mustafa? I think this relates a lot to some of the quotes.
to the quotes, yeah. You've identified it as something you can't control, and then it's realizing what is within your control. So what sort of space do you have that's yours and what isn't yours? And sometimes contamination might happen and it's something that you can't control, but just because it happens, or just because some sort of rules are broken, or some social distancing isn't going on, or hygiene problems there that might cause a risk, doesn't mean that the risk is going to happen. So in a way, it's in the hands of fate, as that quote mentioned. Sort of anything outside the will is to be approached with confidence. What matters is what you're approaching currently. What you're doing is the best that you can do, and focusing on that alone, and just being able to appreciate the moment, and just focusing on what you can control is what gives you the peace of it. And I know it just sounds a bit crazy in the sense of, well, I'm controlling what I can, but there's a possibility that what they're doing is going to affect me, but we don't even know that as well. It's not 100% guaranteed, and there's no point worrying about it, because then if you do worry about it, you're going to reduce your immunity, you're going to make it even worse than what it already sort of technically is, in a sense. So it's finding that peace, being able to control what you can control, and not jeopardizing your system, how you feel, your peace, your body, by worrying about it too much to the point where it gets worse. So yeah, I think that answers the question, hopefully.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'm finding myself becoming more anxious of going outside now and meeting people. I know it feels a bit irrational, and it is, but I wondered if you had any tips for getting back into society a bit more.
What do you think, Landley? Want to take it, or would you like me to take it?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. I'll take that one. I think it's really important to start off by saying, actually, I think a lot of people are really feeling that way, and they are feeling, very concerned about easing back into things. I think even I've experienced that feeling at times, really, where it does feel very strange now, adjusting to perhaps going back to not necessarily completely normal life, but something that resembles it a little bit more. It is very challenging. There's lots of different worries that lots of people have about that, and I think it can be helpful to think about what it is that you're worried about in terms of that, and we can look at challenging some of those thoughts a little bit, like Mustafa mentioned, with some of the thinking traps. So thinking, actually, is this definitely something that's going to happen? For instance, if you're concerned about anything in particular, it could be thinking, is there another way of looking at the situation? So there's different ways we can manage how we think about it to then make it easier for us to be able to go and do some of those things. But similarly, if actually you're just generally really struggling with going out at the moment and feeling quite anxious about it, there is a CBT technique that I'd really recommend called graded exposure. And it's something that is a treatment in its own right, and it does take time, and it's not an overnight fix, but it's about gradually easing yourself back into doing some of the things that you'd like to be doing more of. So it's not about throwing yourself in at the deep end, completely flooding, your emotions and experiences and doing the worst possible thing that you can think of tomorrow. It's about building it up over time. So thinking about ways of breaking down perhaps something that you'd like to be doing, whether it's going to a supermarket or a specific place, or even just getting out of the house full stop and walking down the road and going around the block, thinking about, okay, well, are there some manageable steps that I can work on in between those? So thinking about, for instance, if it was a supermarket, are there smaller shops that I could try to begin with? Could it be just to begin with going down the road, then a little bit further each time, maybe standing outside the shop to begin with, and letting the anxiety come down? You'll find that your confidence will build over time. The anxiety will come down, and the more that you practice that repeatedly, the easier it will be, and the less anxiety provoking it will be each time you do it, and it will snowball, and your confidence will grow, and you'll be able to reach that goal of what potentially might feel impossible right now. But if you break it down into little steps and manage it that way, you'll find it a lot easier than trying to push yourself straight in at the deep end.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Another excellent question, very similar to the last one. This person has put, my partner's, oh, sorry, I got the wrong one. Lockdown has helped them with their anxiety as it gave them control. They made the decision on keeping their kids at home. They stopped people coming into their house, etc. But easing lockdown is bringing a new sense of worry and lack of control. What's your thoughts on that?
Thank you. Would you like to take that one, Mustafa?
Yeah, I don't mind. I'll take it. So similar to how it started before that in terms of the lockdown, it started gently, I suppose, or sort of and basically you've had that feeling similarly before the lockdown started, where it's a new change and then new things are happening. It may have been a bit worrying, and it may have been a bit relieving in the sense of controlling things, that you're able to sort of have your kids in the home, things are going well, you're in control of certain things, and you feel safe. And now it's a new change, and that's okay to sort of feel worried about it. It's very natural to feel worried about these things. And just as we mentioned in terms of the meditation and the mindfulness, is that life is sort of a give and take thing. You breathe in and you breathe out, and change is a part of it. And it's your thoughts that make it, sort of, whether it's sort of peaceful or not. And what I would sort of recommend is sort of taking little simple steps and sort of looking at your thoughts. What are you worried about? Is it sort of something that is a thinking trap, like we mentioned. Are you sort of catastrophizing? Are you thinking of the worst case scenario? You're focusing more on the negative side of things rather than the positive. Spotting those thoughts and sort of being able to challenge them bit by bit, and sort of just starting slowly. It's what we call it is graded exposure in a way. It's sort of just slowly opening up to the world, slowly approaching it. So, for instance, you're worried about going out, for instance, shopping more and stuff like that. You can sort of increase it bit by bit. It's incremental changes, and that's the beauty of it. It takes time, and we sometimes worry that we need to sort of rush things. Think of it as sort of, you don't shout at a seed to grow into a plant and then blossom. You wait for it, and every single stage is a beautiful stage. So it's okay to be worried. It's okay to take your time going through it, and it's okay to not be okay. So it's fine what you're feeling. Just give it a few steps and look at your thoughts, challenge them a bit, and have some time to sort of practice mindfulness and appreciate what you already have. And I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mustafa. So the final question is, my partner's family are not following the lockdown rules. This worries me and makes me frustrated. What can I do to prevent negative thoughts and not let other people's actions bother me?
Would you like to take that, Natalie?
Sure, that's fine, so no problem. And again, I think this ties in a little bit with what some other people have mentioned from the sounds of things. I know that I personally know lots of people too who've had similar concerns and have had similar frustrations really with other people perhaps not behaving in the way that they would, or what they deem to be the best way really to deal with what's happening at the moment. I think it's really important to go back a little bit to some of what Mustafa was speaking about earlier in terms of some of the quotes we were looking at, and focusing on what is in your control and trying to let go of what is not. And it's easier said than done. I know often focusing on what is in our control can give us not necessarily distractions, but it's just a better focus really away from some of those worries. So that in itself can be quite helpful if you focus on what you can do. In terms of actually letting go of some of those worries, in terms of the frustrations you might have in other people's behaviour, which we know isn't our control, we can't control whatever people do, as much as I know perhaps we might like to at times, and perhaps that would be less anxiety provoking for us. In terms of actually letting go of some of that worry, being mindful is probably one of the biggest tips I would recommend there. Is if you notice yourself worrying, often what tends to happen is, as Mustafa mentioned, we get in this cycle and it can spiral, and actually the worry grows the more attention that we give it. If you take your attention away from that worry and focus it back on the here and now, so whatever it is that you're doing at that time, it can be really helpful to try and take your mind away from those worries. And it's very difficult to then be worrying about what you've got for dinner that day or what's happened previously if you're truly focused on the present. So I'd really recommend making time for some of that worry and absolutely just focusing on what you can control and what you can do.
Okay, so thank you to Natalie and Mustafa for their insights and experience on and about how we can all deal with our anxieties at various points. And I have to say, certainly the diaphragmatic breathing, a bit like Dave, I was concentrating on doing that and not concentrating on the webinar. So I'm sure we'd like to thank them for sharing their experiences. Now, my colleagues have put into the chat box a link for the audience for you to share with us your email address so that we can send you this evening a link to the feedback form, and we are giving away copies of Dr. Chatterjee's book Feel Better in 5 as a prize draw at the end of the week. And Dr. Chatterjee is our keynote speaker at lunchtime on Thursday. Finally, I'd like to say a massive thank you to the behind the scenes team here for all their support, and also to you, to all the audience, for your hard work, determination and commitment as we've all worked through this pandemic. A full recording of this live will be uploaded onto the Wellbeing Festival website later today. Please check out the website. There's content being released all day, and all of it will stay there. So there's lots exciting stuff. But thank you all very much for your input, your contribution. Most of all, enjoy the rest of the week and stay safe. Thank you.